Welcome to this episode of the Biology of Trauma podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Aimie. In a world that is quick to make an addiction a moral issue and lack of willpower, it's time we look at how biology predisposes us to addictive tendencies. That is the question answered in this episode. How can our own biology make it easier to fall into an addiction and make it harder to break free? I want to dedicate this episode to the late Dr. Charles Gant, a guest in this episode. Dr. Gant was a real pioneer in applying integrative and functional medicine to addictions and authored the book, End Your Addiction Now. His work and this book influenced me quite a bit in my own training and work as an addiction medicine physician, and I would not have quit my conventional addiction detox practice without his influence and knowing what is possible. Because while traditional addiction treatment programs have recovery rates of less than 50%, Dr. Gant achieved over 83% success rates in his recovery treatment programs. So in this episode, we will look at his work on identifying and treating the underlying causes of addiction and mood disorders through genetic, nutritional, and biochemical testing. Let's get started. Let's start with your story. How did you become such an amazing contributor to this field of medicine where your rates are so much better than most other facilities in terms of the success rate, an 83% success rate where you are a medical director? That is phenomenal for this type of work. What is your story? What is your secret?
Well, I never trusted the general information that I was force-fed in medical school. I always asked the question, is this really getting to the root causes of what problems are, the problems that we address in the world, in ourselves, or in our patients? And so I was never willing to accept the party line, basically. And in medicine, we don't diagnose the root causes, we diagnose the appearance. There's two definitions of diagnosis. You can diagnose the description of a problem, or you can diagnose the root causes. And especially in psychology or addictionology, we're not looking for the root causes and never have to any extent. This is very unsatisfactory to me. I really want to know how things work. Things finally dawned on me as I was progressing in integrative medicine, functional medicine, where now we're testing up to 1,000 variables, immune, toxicological, genetic variables. We keep getting better at finding these root causes for human suffering. And one of those main areas, which could be the number one cause of human suffering and death, if you look at tobacco causing cancer and so forth and heart disease, then it isn't heart disease and cancer. It's the addictions to substances, which is the number one cause of disability and death. So each neurotransmitter segues from a substance. So acetylcholine is the brain's natural tobacco or nicotine. GABA is the brain's natural Valium. Serotonin is the brain's natural Prozac. Dopamine is the brain's natural amphetamine or Ritalin. So all these artificial substances which we give people to mimic neurotransmitters is so unnecessary. Most people can generate these neurotransmitters themselves through taking supplements that are the exact precursor for them. With tobacco, for instance, lecithin or a source of lecithin, which provides the choline precursor, is synthesized into acetylcholine, which is the brain. It's actually the receptors in the brain are called nicotinic. We used to name receptors after the drug that actually stimulated the receptor, but now we know it's a natural neurotransmitter. And then it spreads out through the brain to dopamine and to serotonin. So those three precursors, when taken on a regular basis, in a previous book I wrote, well, it was in the this latest one, and addiction now as well, the tobacco protocol. People can't take that protocol and smoke. The tobacco tastes awful. To you and I, tobacco would taste awful because we're not smokers. And so what these supplements do is essentially makes a person normal, makes them a non-smoker because now they have the full complement of these neurotransmitters and the tobacco tastes awful.
Exactly. I love how this comes together because when we are able to identify the root cause and we're able to actually change the levels of the neurotransmitters, we're able to change how these receptors and the activity is happening in our brain, we're able to do things that pull us out of these dependencies and these addictions or these coping mechanisms that otherwise we would be stuck in. And most people do get stuck in that. And then they seek maybe some of the traditional therapies and treatment programs, and they're given more band-aids rather than actually still addressing this root cause and being able to see actually, hey, you have these imbalances. This is what's happening, and we can do something about that. And addictions come in all forms, Dr. Gant, right? Like it's not just the nicotine, but we can look at, hey, you have these imbalances that even precede your addictions, your substance use, or even if it's just an unhealthy coping mechanism and you notice that you're more stressed and you're engaging in some of these unhealthy coping mechanisms, well, that still comes back to these neurotransmitters and the neurotransmitters that you're stimulating through those unhealthy coping mechanisms.
Yes, and as we have advanced, especially in the last 10 years with genetic testing,
Yes.
it's almost like looking at a crystal ball. Like
Right.
I take a good patient history, but as I dive into the genes, which the person has always had the predispositions for an inability to process serotonin. And so I say, well, how do you do with anger management? How do you deal with resentments? Because your brain is not handling serotonin because the receptor is you have this strange gene that does not allow the receptor to work. Or with GABA, when I find a person that can't make GABA, the brain's natural Valium as well, I ask them or their family members. Lots of times you have to ask the family member, and I ask them about obsessive compulsive thinking, overcautiousness, and these are all traits and characteristics the persons have their whole life.
Exactly.
And it's fun to practice medicine this way because you almost, you can see that how the genetic vulnerabilities
Exactly.
push the person into that. And we, of course, we call these psychological syndromes descriptive diagnoses. Now we can call them causal diagnosis.
Right.
There's two definitions to diagnosis. And of course, I'm looking at the causal because if I know what's causing the problem, then we know exactly what to target to help the problem.
Exactly. We know the points to intervene in that process of the biology.
Exactly.
So one of the things that gets me really excited about this work, Dr. Gant, is that this is exactly what I talk about when I refer to there being a biology of trauma, one that both is a consequence of long-term trauma, past traumas, especially early childhood, where maybe that was a trigger for causing lower amounts of serotonin or lower amounts of dopamine, which we can see. But if a person has these genetic vulnerabilities, it is one of the biological factors that will predispose them to experiencing trauma because there's trauma in life, there is stress in life, but if we have these specific genetic vulnerabilities, we're going to be more prone to experiencing a situation as a trauma that overwhelms our biology, overwhelms our neurobiology to respond if we have low GABA, right? Or if we have low serotonin. And then
our inability to let go, our inability
yes,
to actually face up to whatever the trauma is.
exactly.
Plus, I can bring it in psychotherapy to the present moment and work with it. But that needs all those neurotransmitters to be working
Yes.
for that to happen.
Yes. So this is the problem that I know you've seen this, I've seen this. This is the problem with most substance use disorder programs still to this day, is that they're not addressing this biology piece and they're expecting recovery to happen without supporting these points that we need to be intervening because there are biological vulnerabilities. And this is the same thing that I see in trauma therapies, right? People go to the therapy and they get stuck in that process because they still have these biological vulnerabilities that are keeping their nervous system, their neurobiology in a state of survival.
You can do all the driver's education you want, which is the psychotherapy, the therapies.
Right.
But if there's no gas in the car and you haven't changed the oil for 60,000 miles, you're not going to do very well with driver's education.
Right. So break it down for the audience here, Dr. Gant. What are people missing when they're returning to their coping mechanisms, when they're returning to their addictions after having been through a detox and possibly even some treatment program, and then they relapse? And there's such a high relapse rate. I know that's sad and frustrating for us as providers, for them, for their family members. It's a very frustrating process. And the norm has been to accept that as this is just the disease process. And I think that both you and I are in that camp of no, we will not accept this as the normal because there's
You have to
these
blame
points.
the patient. No matter
We
what.
do. We have to blame the patient, blame it as this is just the disease of addiction. And that's not the case. So share with us, what is that missing piece? Why are people returning to their coping mechanisms and their addictions? Let's go into the neurotransmitters specifically.
We have a brain that is hundreds of millions of years old. It knows how to process, and a lot of these genetic vulnerabilities are actually common because they confer some benefits.
Right.
A person who is anxious and very cautious is an ideal person, and they sleep very lightly. It doesn't take the slightest sound to wake them up. These are very valuable tribal members because the rest of us are sleeping while a saber-toothed tiger is coming up or something. So there are benefits to these genetic predispositions.
And you could almost say that they are adaptations. They are biological adaptations for survival.
Yes, but we live in a very different world now.
We do.
A protein, the quality of our food is markedly deteriorated.
Yes.
If we're eating carbohydrates when they should be eating our Paleolithic diet, which was for the last 2 million years, was essential fatty acids and protein. We ate fish from September till June with seeds and nuts, our omega-3s and omega-6s. So we're not eating the actual nutrition that's necessary to feed the brain.
Yes.
But there's a far more sinister issue in treatment centers, which you mentioned, which is that instead of providing people with the proper IVs, we can provide these amino acids intravenously, and they work very well. People look at me like, what did you put in that IV? I'm not supposed to feel this good. I'm supposed to feel crappy all the time because I'm in recovery. They think
that's just it. Right. They are supposed to feel that good.
Yes. I said, well, you have dopamine for the first time because you have no tyrosine. We tested you, and you have no B vitamins in order to convert the tyrosine into L-dopa and dopamine. Come on. But what has happened, is that by ignoring the biochemistry, the fundamental biochemistry of life, what has happened is that we have created other mimicking types of chemicals that are equally addictive. They're just as brain injurious, and they damage essential parts of our brain where we have our conscience and our prefrontal cortex and executive function. They crush spirituality. So the laundry list of prescribed chemicals to take the place of our neurotransmitters goes on and on, from antidepressants to anxiolytic drugs to ADHD medications, opioids that mimic endorphins, on and on and on. And this is what has corrupted the whole system. And what is a psychotherapist going to do? They're doing good psychotherapy. They want the person to take ownership of their thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And here's a person drugged out. They're drooling, or they're just not available to participate in the way that a good therapist would want them to. But what do they do? The only thing they've ever heard in their training is take more drugs. all these psychiatric medication. I'm saying there's a third way which can greatly limit the need for medication and greatly improve the psychotherapeutic outcomes. And, that,
Absolutely.
and that's what everything you're talking about.
And I know some of the things that you talk about because they are some of the things that I incorporate in my biology of trauma program is the high toxin load also associated with this biology. And even a sugar addiction, right, falls into this. You spoke a little bit about that earlier with the change in our diet towards more carbohydrates. I see that so much in recovery where even, in meetings, it's sugar and donuts, right? Coffee and donuts.
It's carboholism and the carbs, besides diabetes, the carbs will rearrange the microbiome in the intestines
Absolutely.
in a very unhealthy way, especially with fungal overgrowth. And there's no question fungal mycotoxins affect memory and
our neurotoxins.
They're neurotoxins. So healing the gut, healing
becomes very important.
Detoxifying. We did a study years ago, hair testing at a rehab in Florida, and a hair test of that inpatient population. The antimony, arsenic, cadmium, lead poisoning was 2 to 5 standard deviations above the norm. The toxicities are just huge, and the brain is trying to function in the midst of these toxicities, and it can't. Of course, it can't. They're neurotoxins. Person feels awful. They're depressed. The mood's swinging. What are you going to do?
What do you expect?
And what do we do? We don't even do a $100 hair test to rule this out. Right. Insurance pays for a blood heavy metal test, which I do on all patients, of course, and in various ways. It's inexpensive to do this.
In the other world, they just send them to more therapy or more counseling because they're seeing it just as their thoughts or their emotions, and they're not realizing that these are neurotoxins. And until you take those toxins out, your nervous system is getting the signal of active danger and threat.
Yes. So people just got to know that you've really got to take control of your own recovery. You have to address these issues directly. Get in contact with an integrative doctor. There's different kinds. Look at these issues, detoxify, get off of the junk food, do some food allergy testing, because a food allergy could be driving your whole addiction.
Yes.
Like a wheat addiction,
Absolutely.
Celiac. So find out what you're allergic to, get rid of those, clean up your microbiome, take digestive enzymes and probiotics, treat the yeast, and start making gradual progress to normalcy. Bill Wilson originally took the position with the Oxford group. There's something very abnormal about us recovering people. We don't know what it is. Maybe it's an allergy or something. And we now know that whatever the genetic or toxicological or immune or nutritional imbalances were there, you could call it a disease, Bill, but actually it's a physiological imbalance that we can now test for and we can now correct. So just say one last thing about that. Whenever I diagnose any of these kinds of traumatic or psychological problems, there's only one diagnosis to use, which is mood disorder secondary to a physiological cause, because there is no such thing as a mood disorder that does not have well-known, testable physiological causes, and they can be treated and reversed. It doesn't exist. So there's no such thing as a descriptive mood disorder, bipolar disorder, some crap. It's only due to a physiological cause, and we can find that and we can correct.
And there is so much hope in that, because that's where we can not only achieve the recovery and prevent relapses, but have them feeling so well and be able to accelerate their journey to feeling whole and well. And whether, again, this is substance use, this is unhealthy coping mechanisms, this is trauma therapy, it's all the same biology that's playing out here. And we can accelerate that process to such an exciting extent.
Yeah, bridging the gaps, they found that if they gave up patients amino acid treatments every day, within 5 days, they're feeling so good, they don't even need any more treatment. And they would leave against medical advice. So they had to slow them down. They started giving 2 a week. They wanted them to replenish their neurotransmitters, but they didn't want them to feel so good so quickly. But they don't do the family therapy. They don't do the group therapy. They're not getting hooked into AA and a sponsor. They don't do all that because he's feeling great. They say that they had to cut down the IVs.
I love it. So as a recap, we've been talking about the neurotransmitters, the food sensitivities, all of these other physiological core root mechanisms for imbalances that lead to addictions, that lead to people getting stuck in their recovery from trauma, recovery from substance use. And let's specifically talk about some of the opiate, the endorphins, because this brings up our conversation about the locus ceruleus.
Yes.
The locus ceruleus is a part of the brain that is really regulating the amount of noradrenaline in the brain. And so it is important in sleep, in wakefulness, in cognition, in memory, stress, emotion, and pain. And this is where so many people are struggling, and in the United States are ending up on medications or substances that are helping to regulate this locus ceruleus. But it really has some detrimental effects if they're using substances that really shut that down or are affecting the noradrenaline in that forebrain. And that's really where mindfulness happens. And so as we see that happening later on in recovery, but initially, this is a big area of focus for those who are wanting to shift out of a substance use, shifting out of trauma patterns. So talk to us about the locus ceruleus and even specifically the receptors for opiates and the receptors for cannabis that are in the locus ceruleus and why those are important.
If we can help a patient generate their enkephalins, which is the backbone of an endorphin, and the new hemp products now, which are not psychotropic, they take out the psychotropic component and they will fill those receptors in the locus ceruleus, the part of the brain that generates fight, flight, stress. So we have to have that part of the brain. We have to run from a lion or fight a lion. In us, it's so dumb, it's so ancient that it will fire off fight, flight. If we have a business deal that's going south, or I have to face an exam, or any kind of stress, an allergic stress to food, or to a toxic stress, any kind of stress is recorded and processed as a threat to our survival, our biological imperative. One cell in the noradrenaline, this is a quote from physiologists, one cell in the locus ceruleus can ignite all 200 trillion cells in the body.
In the nervous system. Yep.
Just like that. Because there's no warm up. You see a lion, you got to go, or you got
now. Mm-hmm.
There's no ifs, ands, or buts. But it's an old, dumb system. The way that we process and get rid of noradrenaline is through methylation. So that's a term that you hear a lot about. Those of us that are hypomethylators, for various genetic reasons, do not metabolize away our fight flight neurotransmitter as quickly. We tend to be more obsessive compulsive. We worry more. We might miss sleep because we want to make sure the job's done right, that kind of thing. So it's not a bad thing to have when we're young and we're able to put up with stress. So we work harder, we make more money, be more attractive mates, pass on that methylation tendency. So learn about methylation, and the 23andMe testing is a good place to start. You can look for your methylation defects there. I use that in patients because it only costs $100 to get about over 1 million SNPs tested. And maybe, 300 or 400 of them were really interested in for neurotransmitters and for methylation. So we got to make the bad neurotransmitter go away.
Yeah.
And we want to feed the good neurotransmitters like serotonin, your brain's natural Prozac, or dopamine, brain's natural cocaine. We want to feed the good ones. And
Yep.
we can do that very naturally.
Before we jump to the good ones, I would love, which I think is really important to share with the audience before we finish up today, because I want them to be able to walk away with, okay, these are my good ones, and what can I do to feed those today?
Right.
Before we jump there, you said so many good things right there that I want to make sure that people caught that gold that you were sharing. And one of them is that this noradrenaline, and how when there is any sense of a threat or a danger, one cell in the locus ceruleus can ignite the entire nervous system, survival system, body. Exactly. The nervous system includes the peripheral nervous system, not just the brain. And this is where somatic experiencing has become so huge for me, and one of the interventions and tools that I use so much in my practice now, because this noradrenaline and this ability for it to course through your body, and you can feel it immediately, right? Like you can feel that moment of surge of energy throughout your body. And the tendency for many people who have these types of deficiencies in their neurotransmitters, especially serotonin, GABA, even the endorphins, is that sense of overwhelm that happens so quickly when there is a response to danger that they actually go into the freeze response.
Yes.
And rather than acting out, rather than actually moving into action and movement that will discharge that surge of energy that your body just put out with the noradrenaline, the body shuts that down. And there's this noradrenaline, there's this charge in that gets stored in the tissues. This is a big part of the biology of trauma. And methylation becomes
PTSD.
Yes,
all that,
exactly. Yes, all of those. Yes. And this is where the methylation piece becomes so important for those people who notice that, wow, my body gets overwhelmed really quickly. It not only goes into sympathetic very quickly, but it also goes into overwhelm and that shutdown and that collapse very quickly. And a large percentage of these people, I'm finding with the testing, that they are undermethylators, like you are saying. And so I work with a lot of people who are even in the best of trauma therapies, are doing even the somatic experiencing and the movements that help discharge this stored noradrenaline from the locus ceruleus.
Exercise.
And exercise, right? Exactly. And yet, because they have this methylation imbalance, many more people in our society are undermethylators now rather than overmethylators. And like you're saying, it's the undermethylators that really have this problem with the noradrenaline and going into that place of
Which they want to medicate.
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
And it's the undermethylators. Yes, the undermethylators that I am noticing are going more towards the opiates and even the cannabis. And that makes sense because there's so many of those opiate receptors and cannabis receptors in the locus ceruleus that dampen down that noradrenaline response.
Yes. And so now this segues into the next question. What is our natural equipment? What do we have to take a stand against this animal fight, flight, sympathetic nervous system, which all animals have?
Right.
What do we?
This is normal, right?
So we have this amazing prefrontal cortex. We have a sixth of our brain right over our eyes, and its job is to observe, to become aware of, and in the process of taking ownership, being aware of our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. They are modulated. They are stepped down. In the recovery process, they call this letting go, turning over. Somehow there's this tendency that if we get honest enough and direct enough and expressive enough, that this letting go process begins to happen. But actually, this is simply a process of self-awareness or mindfulness. In the 11th step of AA is meditation, prayer and meditation, doing that inner work modulates these animalistic impulses to fight, flight,
Survival patterns.
all that stuff. Exactly. And getting that inner peace, getting some quiet, breaking into the constant dialogue
Chatter.
and chatter. Exactly. As soon as people see it, as soon as they experience, it's like, oh my goodness, I can do that. I have within me this part of us that is pulled, like Abraham Maslow would talk about it, as a need to self-actualize, to become aware, and not to live my life as a reactive robot all the time.
Exactly.
But the prefrontal cortex, unfortunately, is the most vulnerable to psychotropic medication because it's our most recent evolutionary device. It's only happened in the last few million years or so. So it's a new kid on the block. It hasn't stood the test of time the way the more rugged parts of the brain have. And so it cannot tolerate the psychotropic injury from prescribed or illicit or commonly used psychotropic substances. We really have to be sober in order to take ownership of our conscience. And with this part of the brain, its most important function, it appears, and that this is from the PET scans and the functional MRIs and psychological testing, it is the part of our brain that's designed for caring for one another. That's its ultimate purpose. And overriding that animal brain, which wants to control people, wants to dominate people, wants to hurt people, on and on and on, that my survival will be benefited if I do something harmful to you. See, that'll improve my chances of survival. And we can transcend that need, that animal need. When we do, mindfulness recruits a lot of neurotransmitters, like we were talking about, to subdue the locus ceruleus, to quiet it down. I don't have the direct reference of the connection. I know there are neurons going from the prefrontal to the locus ceruleus. I'm not sure which neurotransmitters they're using, whether they're using the brain's natural endocannabinoids or the brain's natural endorphins, but undoubtedly that's going to play a role as time goes on.
Exactly. So one last thing that I wanted us to be able to leave people with is, how do we actually feed naturally our serotonin system, our natural endorphin system? So what are some things that, and I know this is hard to do, but what are some of the nutrients? What are some of the supplements that people would be able to take in order to just start feeding those receptors, those neurotransmitters, and those systems in their brain for building the healthy neurotransmitters, the good neurotransmitters?
Well, we don't really know what people are missing until we test. So we
Yes.
are saying, if you don't test, you guess. So we can guess. You can take precursors. You can read a book on this and say, I think my problem is amphetamines, Ritalin. I'm tired all the time. I don't have enough of that dopamine, joyful stimulation. I think tyrosine would be my supplement, and you would want to take it with a B complex, because several B vitamins are needed to convert tyrosine into the brain's natural cocaine. So sometimes you can guess what you're deficient in simply by looking at the substance that you're attracted to.
Or your symptoms, behaviors.
And in that book, there was a questionnaire where you can score yourself according to the symptoms. But without testing, we don't really know what it is that you're deficient in. But everybody needs a B complex. Everybody needs essential fatty acids, fish oil at the very least, fish oil and borage oil. Everybody needs probiotics to heal the microbiome, probably digestive enzymes to extract those essential fats and essential amino acids out of food. Everybody needs some of these basic supplements that we give everybody to get at least to a certain step. Saunas, Epsom salt baths, exercise, sweating, getting rid of the toxins, drinking lots of pure water, filtered water, to flush out all this toxicity that's been holding everybody back. So these are just basic principles of healing that can help everyone.
basic principles, and yet can be game changing for those who have a big toxin load or who are deficient or have imbalances in their omegas. And that's causing a lot of issues. Those were big issues for me. And when I started introducing the things from your protocols, it was game changing for me because those were the deficiencies that my poor nervous system was struggling with. So again, thank you so much for your work. This has been such an honor to be able to interview you and have you share your work with others. And I really appreciate your time and sharing this with the audience.
Yes, thank you very much.
And thank you for tuning into this episode of the Biology of Trauma podcast. If you would like to know more about this topic of mood, addiction, trauma, and recovery, then I have resources for you in the show notes. I want to start with the 3 most common biochemical imbalances that I've seen in mood disorders, in my addiction medicine practice, and in those people with persistent trauma patterns. These are common ones that I have seen in most of my patients. And they make us feel emotions deeper. They make us be more sensitive, more irritable at times, competitive driven. They make us more susceptible to developing both stored trauma in our body and addictions. And so we want to look at, do we possibly have one of these biochemical imbalances? I'll have my guide and what to do about it in the show notes. I want to share with you some related podcast episodes. Episode 93 is one you'll want to look at. Is lithium the answer to a regulated nervous system? Depression and addiction treatment. This is with Dr. James Greenblatt. Episode 41 is on the neurotransmitters that are often involved in the addictions. And so we want to look at solutions for low serotonin and GABA in trauma with Trudy Scott, my friend and nutritionist Trudy Scott. And then going all the way back to episode 1, this is going to be a different take on addictions. This is with Dr. Peter Levine, and it's on, can we become addicted to the freeze response? Even if you don't know what the freeze response is, that would be a reason to go back and listen to episode 1. And then I have a related YouTube video that I want to share with you, which is on our detoxification pathways. Our detoxification pathways are how we detox, and this is going to be an important part of recovery for anyone who's been on substances, even food, and need to detox, and the role of methylation. So the YouTube video is on trauma and toxins, methylation, and unblocking our body's detoxification pathways. And that will be an important circling back to the biochemical imbalances, since one of them is on methylation. With that, I am here to save you time and money by bringing you practical information that will help you accelerate the healing journey. So take a moment, subscribe, rate, leave a review. Your feedback is how I know how to improve this podcast, bring you great content, and help others find information that can change their life as well. I'm your host, Dr. Aimie. Until next episode, lots of love.